My wicked problem project had to deal with the Michigan benchmark of creation in fine arts education. There are 5 benchmarks in the Michigan Department of Education for fine arts education. And unfortunately, in many music classrooms, performance, which is the first benchmark, takes up the majority of instructional time. I wanted to create a unit and an assessment that allowed my kids to be creative. I often use the analogy of writers, authors, and readers. Would we consider you a good writer if you could simply just read? I use that analogy with my band. Would we consider you a successful musician if you could only recreate what somebody else had done? So I wanted to create a lesson that allowed for creativity. Furthermore, I wanted to challenge myself and actually do it in a non-performance class, which for me is my history of rock and roll class. So my solution has to do with podcasting. Podcasting is a growing trend. It has been popular for some time now, but for many of my students in my small rural school, podcasting is not the rave that it is in other parts of the country. I wanted my students to use real-world skills. And so what I decided that I was going to do is that my students were going to create radio shows via podcasting. This was going to give them the real-world skills of recording your voice, editing, uploading to an internet website, and using multiple tracks to come up with a consistent audio podcast. In addition, their final product would be available to anyone with an internet connection. They could then upload it to a personal website if at some point they created one of those. We could email out links to Board of Education, to administrators, to parents, and it could really be a great piece of PR for our school district. So logistically, how was this going to happen? Let's start by discussing the technology that was going to be used. Students, first and foremost, were going to be required to use microphones to record their voice into the computer. This recording would then be used and uploaded into Audacity, the technology you see on the right side of your screen. Audacity, which is a free software, would be the primary technology used to edit, splice, insert musical recordings, and export the final podcast. Their final podcasts would then be uploaded onto Podomatic.com, which is the easiest podcast site that I have had experience using. The knowledge would need to be scaffolded. For example, most of my students are not going to be familiar with a lot of these technologies. So in order to pull off a successful technology unit, or a unit that simply uses technology as a tool, my students are going to need to become semi-fluent in these technologies. So we would need to start with an explanation of Audacity, with an explanation of Podomatic, and probably with an explanation in general of what a podcast is. The final project would then be the culmination, and it would be uploaded to a website viewable or listenable to whomever has the link. So then how does this apply to TPAC? First and foremost, I wanted my assessment, my unit, to be student-led. Typically in this class in the past, it has been very traditional. Me at the front discussing, giving notes, maybe using a PowerPoint, using some audio examples, but very much a traditional classroom. I wanted to get out of the way. I wanted my students to be proactive in their own education. And so I wanted to be, as one of my professors has put it, the guide on the side. Furthermore, I wanted to give my students some real-world skills. What's the point in introducing a new technology if it's nothing that they're ever going to be interested in using again? I wanted to introduce a tool that some of them may use in a career or simply just use to create newscasts, or they could use it in English class, or they could use it in some other facet of their life. They can record, edit, cut, all of these things. These are real world skills. Finally, I wanted my students to be proactive in the musical culture. This was one of the problem areas that I wanted to attack, is that my students don't understand how musical culture operates as a society. They understand that a band or an artist makes a CD. They understand that somebody buys that, but they have trouble connecting the dots, realizing that everything has an effect on everything else. So let's take a quick listen to a quick example. And the example that you're going to hear in this podcast, this student decided that for their podcast, they were going to argue whether sampling is creative or a cop-out. Let's take a listen for just a second.
Okay, wow, that was an innocent example of sampling. Stuff like that can easily turn in, it's almost bordering on theft, and there have been instances where an artist just meant to sample a chorus or something from another artist, and it has turned into theft. For example, Vanilla Ice took the bass groove for the song, from the song Under Pressure by David Bowie and Queen, and used that in his hit Ice Ice Baby, if you want to take a listen to that.
So in this example, this student had to research audio examples, had to come up with historical research, had to make a constructive argument as to how sampling in music today was theft or was a creative cop-out. Now, in any implementation of any lesson, there were definitely bumps in the road. For us, we had a huge bump in the road when the students and I got together to do the initial trial run of the podcast. We recorded it into Audacity as planned. We started editing it with Audacity as planned, and we saved it on our school server. And we came back one day, and for some reason somebody had gotten into the server and had deleted these files. And so we had to go back, rework, make adjustments. And so we now know, using technology, the technology can sometimes not do what you ideally want it to do. And so this was a huge bump in the road. It actually turned out to be a positive in the end, because we were able to go reflect on mistakes that we had made or things that we wanted to tweak and go back. But with the bumps come delights. My number one delight with the implementation of this project came with the depth that my students wanted to take their radio shows, or in this sense, the debate. They picked the debate topic, they delved, they wanted to go deeper. They asked questions of each other, they asked questions of me. They wanted input on specific viewpoints. I even had one student who, as a challenge, wanted to argue the position that they did not believe in, to challenge their belief system. So they researched the other belief system. It was really very, very cool to see. The students really took charge. I was really there as simply a troubleshooting tool. Once I introduced the technology, once I handed out the assignment, it really was in the students' hands, and I did not need to be the quote-unquote teacher anymore. I was simply an onlooker. With the findings, though, this is the important part. What did I find out? We used a briefer implementation than I had originally planned due to time constraints at the end of the year. I initially wanted multiple student groups to go through this podcast in multiple formats. We weren't able to do that due to computer lab time and microphone use, and getting to the end of the year, we were only allowed time for one group. So when I do this in the future, it will be with more groups. The evidence of success, however, was outstanding. Even after the assignment was done, the debate didn't stop. These students brought in other class members and continued the debate. They talked about the lesson in other classes. And you know, when you start talking to teenagers about music, they are going to participate. And so the success was there. The education was not stopping at the end of the classroom. The podcast was then played for different staff members and administrators, and it was something that the students were very, very proud of. I think it's great whenever a high school student says, "That was a pretty cool assignment." I think cool is a great indicator of a high schooler enjoying the assignment. That being said, I also took a bit of pleasure in struggling students. And I don't mean struggling with necessarily content, but some of my students that did the lesson struggled in challenging what their belief systems were. Some thought that they were really steadfast and that they knew what they thought, and they thought they had good examples, and they thought that those examples proved their point, when in fact they did not, and in some cases they even helped the other side. And so seeing them have to struggle through a belief system really was a cool thing to see, and they came out of it in the end more creative thinkers, more critical thinkers. And I think that critical thinking is always evidence of success. So for the future, when I go to implement this in the fall, one of my group members really brought up the point of coming up with maybe some Audacity tutorials and experimentation, because it is such a primary technology in the assignment. Should we start really maybe just with a unit on Audacity and start with tinkering with Audacity so that we can become very familiar with it? It was even suggested to me to do some mini podcasts, maybe an album review, maybe a personal musical introduction, but something to get students familiar with the technology that they would later be graded on. In addition, we need to be able to bridge the technology gap between students. Even in a rural school, you are going to have students who are very, very comfortable with technology, and you're going to have students who are very uncomfortable with technology, and we must reach them in the same way. So in that sense, we can really use some students who have experience with Audacity, maybe a student who piloted the project, and use them as co-teachers so that the technology does not become a hindrance, it just becomes a tool. This then leads into the conclusion. It's very important for me to make the point that technology must be a tool, and so the insertion of technology into the classroom needs to be as effortless as possible. If the technology is something that we simply use to say we used it, then really we're not doing anything new or innovative. It must simply be another avenue to assess, to learn, and to create. As I'm going through this conclusion and thinking back to what we were doing and my goals at the beginning, I'm really left with a couple of questions. And the first one is writing really going away? And for me, this is a big point with this assignment because we've been pushing our students to write better, to write better, to write better. It's on every standardized test. You need to be able to write better. But with Web 2.0 technologies and with the things that we're able to do now, is the emphasis still on the same traditional writing? Or are technologies like podcast and the spoken word going to start being the standard that we measure by? If so, in what other uses can I really find value in podcasting? In what ways can I go to teachers and say, you should try this. This is really a worthwhile tool investigating. So I hope that this has provided a good overview of what I've been doing for the past couple months in my podcasting Wicked Problem project. And thank you for listening.